Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Ian D. Thatcher's book Trotsky. Um, it's about his final years of exile. Um, I'm reading this because just uh, get some more hopefully get some more insight, find something new out about Trotsky in this period, which for my purposes is when he develops his idea of the degenerated worker state. For Trotsky, the period of Turkish exile from 1929 to 33 had not been unproductive. Several important books were completed, including an autobiography and the three-volume The History of the Russian Revolution. A new journal, the Bulletin of the Opposition, was established as a fighting organ against Stalin and for the world revolution. Despite these advances and the beauty of his surroundings, Trotsky was clearly frustrated by being so far from the key political developments of the time. In 1933, there was at last the opportunity to return to Western Europe. Trotsky settled first in France from 1933 to 1935 and then in Norway from 1935 to 1936. Any expectations that a move to France would provide more fertile ground for the spreading of Trotsky's political influence were to be disappointed. It was easier to meet with other Trotskyists, but there was little chance of Trotsky stepping onto a broader political stage. It even proved impossible to locate a permanent residence free from the public eye and controversy. In the 2 years they were to spend in France, for example, the Bronsteins had no less than a dozen addresses of varying leases. The all too frequent changes of abode occurred despite Trotsky's efforts to avoid upsetting his governmental hosts. For the most part, the French state was content to keep contact with Trotsky to a minimum. He was, after all, a marginal figure with no large following or mass organization at his fingertips. Even so, there was always the likelihood that he would become a political hot potato, a potential embarrassment to any government. The increasing polarization of European politics into left and right helped, amongst other factors, to ensure that Trotsky's future was always under question. A turn to the left could result in an invitation and a visa. A turn to the right or a worsening of the international drama could produce an exit order. In requesting that Trotsky find another country of residence, Paris could at least object to his articles on the radical left and the possibility of a French Revolution. After all, was it not a condition of his visa that he abstain from political activity? With this lesson in mind, as part of his next visa application, Trotsky promised the Norwegian authorities that he would not enter into its national life as a revolutionary. Given these guarantees, the newly elected Social Democratic government at first welcomed Trotsky to Norway in 1935. However, Trotsky's writings on non-Norwegian affairs were controversial and his hosts were made uncomfortable by Soviet objections to Trotsky's presence so close to its borders. The Norwegian government thought it best to place Trotsky under house arrest. He was rescued from this awkward situation by an invitation to live in Mexico. The offer was gratefully received. The move to North America, where the Bronsteins arrived in mid-January 1937 after a month-long journey by boat, was made possible by representations made on Trotsky's behalf by, amongst others, the famous artist Diego Rivera, to the then radical government headed by General Lázaro Cárdenas. I'm going to look this person up. Not Diego Rivera, although I probably should look him up as well. Lázaro Cárdenas, who lived from 1895 to 1970, was a Mexican army officer and politician who served as president of Mexico from 1934 to 1940. Previously, Lázaro Cárdenas served as a general in the Constitutional Army during the Mexican Revolutionary and as governor of Coyoacán and the president of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Lázaro Cárdenas later served as the Secretary of National Defense. During Lázaro Cárdenas's presidency, which is considered the end of the Maximato, Lázaro Cárdenas implemented massive land reform programs, led the expropriation of the country's oil industry, and implemented many left-leaning reforms. Born in Jiquilpan, Michoacán, to a working-class family, Lázaro Cárdenas joined the Mexican Revolution and became a general in the Constitutionalist Army. Although he is not from the state of Sonora, whose revolutionary generals dominated Mexican politics in the 1920s, Cárdenas was handpicked by Plutarco Elias Calles, Sonoran general and former president of Mexico, as a presidential candidate and won in the 1934 general election. After founding the National Revolutionary Party, PNR, in the wake of the assassination of President-elect Álvaro Obregón, Plutarco Elias Calles had unofficially remained in power during the Maximato, which was between 1928 and 1934, and expected to maintain that role when Cárdenas took office. Cárdenas, however, outmaneuvered him politically and forced Calles into exile. Lázaro Cárdenas established the structure of the National Revolutionary Party, eventually named the Party of the Mexican Revolution, or the sectoral representation of peasant leagues, labor union confederations, and the Mexican Army. Cárdenas's incorporation of the army into the party structure was a deliberate move to diminish the power of the military and prevent their intervention in politics through coup d'etat. A left-wing economic nationalist, Lázaro Cárdenas led the expropriation of the Mexican oil industry and the creation of the state-owned oil company Pemex in 1938. Lázaro Cárdenas implemented large-scale land reform programs in Mexico, distributed large estates to smallholders in lands termed ejidos. Lázaro Cárdenas created the National Polytechnic Institute, IPN, and El Colegio de México, Colmex. Lázaro Cárdenas' foreign policy supported and gave asylum to Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. An achievement of Cárdenas was his complete surrender of power in December 1940 to his successor, Manuel Ávila Camacho, who was a political moderate without a distinguished military record. Cárdenas has been praised as, quote, the greatest constructive radical of the Mexican Revolution, end quote, for implementing its ideals, but has also been criticized as a, quote, authoritarian populist, end quote. Lázaro Cárdenas was the first Mexican president to serve for a sexenio, a practice that continues today. According to numerous opinion polls and analysts, Lázaro Cárdenas is the most popular Mexican president of the 20th century. So that's Lázaro Cárdenas. Back to the text. In Mexico, Trotsky had a freedom of expression and movement that he could no longer enjoy in his old stomping ground of Europe. Then there were even some celebrity visitors, including the novelist André Breton, who's the great surrealist author. Was a communist, then a Trotskyist, and then an anarchist by the end of his life. The relative openness of Trotsky's existence, however, also created opportunities for Trotsky's enemies. It was in his own study that a Stalinist agent carried out a successful assassination attempt in August 1940. The constant movement and uncertainties must have upset Trotsky's work patterns and routines. Nevertheless, Trotsky maintained a healthy output of newspaper articles, pamphlets, and books, as well as a vast correspondence with fellow Trotskyists. Trotsky's political activities were dominated by the struggle to expose Stalin's crimes, typified above all in the series of public show trials brought against old Bolsheviks that began in August 1936. A related task was the foundation of a new international Marxist body, the Fourth International. Much of Trotsky's energy was spent adjudicating the factional infighting between various shades of Trotskyist opinion. Trotsky devoted so much of his time to issues affecting the Fourth International because Trotsky considered its creation to be the major task of his remaining political life. The stakes were set very high, for Trotsky believed that only a new Bolshevik-Leninist international vanguard could carry out a world revolution, in this way saving the Russian Revolution from Stalinist degeneration and humanity from fascism and war. New section: Stalin and Stalinism. For several years following the return to Europe, Trotsky wrote less on the USSR than at any other time of his career. On New Year's Eve 1935, Trotsky issued a press communique responding to readers' requests for more articles on the Soviet Union. Of course, developments in Russia had not escaped Trotsky's attention altogether. Trotsky had devoted several articles to a defense of his conception of the USSR as a worker state, so defined because state ownership of the means of production was the dominant form of property. At the same time, Trotsky was keen to expose all aspects of its bureaucratic deformations, including the privileged lifestyles of the top state officials and the constant police surveillance and repression of opposition. For Trotsky, there was a basic contradiction in the center of Soviet society. The workers were growing in numbers, culture, and self-confidence as a consequence of planned industrialization. Therefore, they could not help but become increasingly dissatisfied with the caste of bureaucratic overlords. At some point, the workers would seek to rid themselves of paper-pusher parasites in the cause of deepening and furthering the country's socialist foundations. It was every Bolshevik-Leninist duty, according to Trotsky, to hasten the day when the workers would turn against the bureaucracy. Indeed, Trotsky saw some evidence of cracks appearing in the facade of Stalin's harmonious utopia in the famous assassination of the Leningrad party chief Sergei Kirov in early December 1934. I'm going to look up Sergei Kirov. Everyone knows who Sergei Kirov is. His assassination is often compared to the Reichstag fire in Nazi Germany as a pretext for increased repression by the state and the consolidation of totalitarian rule. But I'm going to read his biography here real quick, or the intro from Wikipedia. Sergei Mironovich Kirov, born Kastrikov, lived from 1886 to December 1934, and was a Russian and Soviet politician and Bolshevik revolutionary. Sergei Kirov was an early revolutionary in the Russian Empire and member of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Kirov became an old Bolshevik and personal friend of Joseph Stalin, rising through the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ranks to become head of the party in Leningrad and a member of the Politburo. On the 1st of December 1934, Kirov was shot and killed by Leonid Nikolaev at his offices in the Smolny Institute. Nikolaev and several alleged accomplices were convicted in a show trial and executed less than 30 days later. Kirov's assassination was used by Stalin as a reason for starting Moscow trials and the Great Purge. Based on circumstantial evidence, a number of historians concluded that the assassination was ordered by Stalin. Back to the text. Trotsky did not deny that Stalin would use this event as a pretext for further repression. The principal blows, he thought, would be directed against some wavering sections of the bureaucracy to keep the state apparatus in line, and against the remnants of the left opposition to weaken opposition against another likely turn to the right. But from the fragments of information that were released about Kirov's murder, he did not for one moment suggest that Stalin had issued a death warrant as a means of seeing off a potential rival. The assassin may have had links with the state political administration GPU, but no official. Trotsky was convinced had ordered Kirov's elimination. Whether it was carried out for personal or general motives, Whether the assassination was carried out for personal or general motives, Trotsky believed that the assassination was a reflection of social discontent with Stalin's bureaucratic terror. In the absence of open political channels for the expression of complaint, such acts of individual terror were to an extent understandable and even unavoidable. But Trotsky warned they could not in themselves bring about a fundamental change in the political landscape. Only class struggle, the joint and concerted effort of the vanguard workers, could topple the Stalinist bureaucracy. Before they could reach this conclusion, however, the workers would need a correct Marxist education and leadership. This was the task that Trotsky set for his propaganda. When Stalin and his cohorts announced a new constitution in 1936 as the most, quote, democratic in the world, end quote, Trotsky's immediate riposte was an article highlighting the fallacy of Stalinist democracy. The workers could smash this facade of a socialist heaven and turn it into a reality. Trotsky advised only if they joined the Fourth International. In the summer of 1936, Trotsky completed his fullest single study of the USSR, published the following year under the title The Russian Revolution. Of all his exile writings, this was the book most likely to reach a wide audience. Its publication in a paperback English translation came hot on the heels of the famous Soviet show trials that made world headlines. Just as Trotsky had finished the manuscript in August 1936, some 16 leading old Bolsheviks, including Zinoviev and Kamenev, were indicted at public show trials for terrorist crimes against the socialist state. After admitting the prosecution's case, the defendants were shot. There was to be two more centerpiece show trials, both of which featured Trotsky's former allies. In 1936, the leftist U. Pyatakov and Karl Radek were among 17 accused. Grigory Pyatakov lived from 1890 to 1937 and was a Ukrainian revolutionary and Bolshevik leader and a key Soviet politician during the 1917 Russian Revolution. Georgy Pyatakov was considered by contemporaries to be one of the early communist states' best economic administrators, but with poor political judgment. We all know who Karl Radek is. But I'm going to look him up anyway, just to see if there's anything I don't remember. Karl Bernardovich Radek, who lived from 1885 to 1939, was a revolutionary and writer active in the Polish and German social democratic movements before World War I and a communist international leader in the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. Karl Radek was born to a Jewish family in Lemberg, Austria-Hungary. Karl Radek joined the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania and took part in the 1905 Russian Revolution in Congress, Poland. 2 years later, Karl Radek was forced to flee to Germany, where Karl Radek worked as a journalist for the Social Democratic Party of Germany. After the outbreak of World War I, Karl Radek relocated to Switzerland and became an associate of Vladimir Lenin. Following the February Revolution, Radek helped to organize the return of Lenin and other Russian revolutionaries to Russia, though he himself was denied entry until after the October Revolution. As Vice Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Karl Radek took part in the negotiations of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Karl Radek helped establish the Communist Party of Germany after the revolution began and spent a year in prison for his role in the Spartacist uprising. After returning to Russia, Karl Radek became a member of the Comintern Executive Committee. The failure of the revolution in Germany, as well as his support for Leon Trotsky against Joseph Stalin, ultimately led to Karl Radek's fall from power and expulsion from the party. Karl Radek later recanted his views and was readmitted to the party. Nevertheless, during the Great Purge, Karl Radek was accused of treason and arrested. Karl Radek was found guilty as a chief defendant at the Moscow show trial in 1937 and sentenced to 10 years of penal labor. Karl Radek died in a labor camp in the Urals 2 years later. So, back to the text. In January 1937, the leftists Pyatakov and Karl Radek were among the 17 accused. In March 1938, the 21 defendants included Trotsky's long-standing associate, Christian Rakovsky. I don't know if it'll be out first, this or that, but I just read a very long introduction to a book of selected writings by Christian Rakowski. I'm going to put that up on the channel soon. So that might be up before this or after that, but I'm not going to read the intro for the Wikipedia for Christian Rakowski because I'm kind of sick of reading his name over and over again. The Revolution Betrayed, the book, did not mark a new development in Trotsky's views on the USSR. The Revolution Betrayed contained a summary of previously held beliefs and conceptions. This would not necessarily have struck a contemporary reader, most likely unaware of the Russian language bulletin of the opposition. The deepest impression the work makes is the extent to which Trotsky thought the Stalin regime had betrayed the Bolsheviks' original aims and intentions. It was a betrayal, Trotsky argued, that affected all aspects of Soviet life. In politics, the Bolshevik program of 1917 was proletarian democracy, including freedom of criticism within the party and the Soviets. It had been replaced by a totalitarian order characterized most obviously by the rule of an unelected bureaucracy and police repression of any critical voices. For society, the Bolsheviks had desired, if not absolute equality, something which lay in the complete communist society of the future, then at least that inequality be kept within certain limits. For example, Lenin had famously insisted that wages of the state officials should be no higher than the pay of packet of a skilled worker. In the Soviet Union, observed Trotsky, however, there was gross and increasing inequality, both between and within social groups. The most marked contrast lay in the lifestyle of the bureaucracy compared with the experiences of ordinary citizens. The bureaucrats could expect spacious accommodation, including a holiday home in the countryside. The workers were provided with cramped and inadequate housing and could even be reduced to sharing a bed on a shift basis in a worker's dormitory. The bureaucrats enjoyed access to specialist shops carrying a range of choice consumer goods. Ordinary citizens had to resort to survival strategies such as scouring the black market or stealing from state enterprises to meet their basic needs. Society was thus clearly divided between a privileged elite and a citizenry suffering from want. Trotsky highlighted the divide and rule tactics employed by the bureaucracy against the working class, mainly to prevent an impoverished mass from uniting in revolt. It favored, for example, the formation of a labor aristocracy, partially via wage differentials and partly via the distribution of benefits and competitive work schemes. One of the most famous examples of Stalinist pandering to a labor elite was the Stakhanovite movement. This rewarded workers who emulated the achievement of the coal miner Alexei Stakhanov, who in August 1935 overfulfilled a work shift norm by more than 14 times. Just for a refresher, if anyone's coming to this for the first time, Alexei Stakhanov lived from January 1906 to November 1977 and was a Soviet miner, hero of socialist labor, and a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Alexei Stakhanov became a celebrity in 1935 as part of what became known as the Stakhanovite movement, a campaign intended to increase worker productivity and demonstrate the superiority of the socialist economic system. And the Stakhanovite movement was a mass cultural movement of workers which originated in the Soviet Union and encouraged socialist emulation and rationalization of workplace processes. The Stakhanovites modeled themselves after Alexei Stakhanov, a coal miner, and took pride in their ability to produce more than was required by working harder and more efficiently, thus contributing to the common good and strengthening the socialist state. The movement began in the coal industry, but later spread to many other industries in the Soviet Union. Initially popular, the Stakhanovite movement eventually encouraged resistance as increased productivity led to increased demands on workers. Back to the text. In cultural life, the October Revolution had, Trotsky stated, initially taken gigantic strides towards the liberation of women and the elimination of religious superstition. Stalin's USSR, in contrast, had abolished a woman's right to abortion and was developing a cult of the bourgeois nuclear family. The attack on religious belief had been abandoned in favor of a, quote, positive neutrality, end quote, or reconciliation between church and state. The priesthood would now enjoy greater freedom to fool the people with their non-scientific, superstitious nonsense. In international affairs, Lenin had welcomed the October Revolution as the first step of the unfolding world revolution. Stalin had a narrowly nationalist outlook, summed up in the policy of socialism in one country. Stalin's diplomats were no longer the soldiers of world revolution, but had adopted the dress codes and manners of traditional bourgeois diplomacy. In 1934, the USSR had even joined that arch-imperialist club, the League of Nations. The foreign communist parties were tolerated only insofar as they were useful for domestic Soviet security goals. Even in the one area in which the original gains of 1917 had been offered some protection, the nationalization of the economy and the instigation of planning, the Stalinist leadership had committed gross policy errors, including crash course expansion, that were undermining the economy's socialist foundations. The system described by the revolution betrayed was clearly not socialist. Trotsky defined the USSR as a, quote, transitional regime, end quote, lying somewhere between capitalism and the beginnings of the lowest forms of socialism. Current Soviet claims to have completed the first stage of socialist construction were, Trotsky argued, clearly exaggerated. But why had the revolution ended up in such a sorry condition? Trotsky highlighted several interlocking factors. Some were clearly outside the control of the Stalin leadership, most notably the heritage of Russia's poverty, the hostility of international capitalism, and the crimes of reformist social democracy, which sought accommodation with the factory bosses instead of their overthrow in a socialist revolution. These objective difficulties had, however, been compounded by the political mistakes of the Soviet bureaucracy. In a self-interested defense of its numerous privileges, it had followed a conservative anti-revolutionary policy at home and abroad. For the workers of the USSR and the world, one key question remained. Would the Soviet Union correct its deformations and return to socialism, or would the Soviet Union's degeneration continue to the restoration of full-scale capitalism? For Trotsky, the USSR's fate would be decided by a living struggle of forces, domestic and international. At home, the workers had to overthrow the bureaucracy by a political revolution. This would only bring benefits, however, if it was supported by the international proletariat. Outside of world revolution, Trotsky saw no hope for the long-term prospects of a communist USSR. As a critique of current Soviet boast to be a socialist paradise, evident in the 1936 Constitution's statement that, quote, the exploitation of man by man, end quote, had been eliminated, the revolution betrayed has much to recommend it. It has stood the test of time far better than the panegyrics of the then Western-based friends of the Soviet Union. The British socialists Sidney and Beatrice Webb, famous for their book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, were the rightful target of Trotsky's biting humor. 1 second. I want to see if there's anything for this book. I'm not really seeing anything for this. Yeah, I'm not really seeing anything for that. It's on Amazon, but I'm not seeing any kind of like, what's it called? What's the word I'm looking for? Synopsis. Modern research, with its access to archives and Soviet police reports, can give a much fuller picture of the life in the mid-1930s Soviet Union, but its detail often confirms rather than refutes many of Trotsky's claims of the time. Recent work on everyday life, for example, paints a depressing picture of the trials and tribulations of the ordinary Soviet man and more often woman in search of scarce resources. Similarly, studies of popular opinion in Stalin's Russia also stressed the gulf that citizens felt separated the bureaucratic, quote, them, end quote, from the ordinary, quote, us, end quote. Understandably, the privileges enjoyed by the bureaucracy and its favored workers were the source of widespread social resentment. It is less clear, however, whether the population wanted to right these wrongs via socialism or by its overthrow. Trotsky felt that the Soviet proletariat remained sympathetic to socialism and that its socialist aspirations were a serious hindrance to the bureaucracy's preference for capitalism. Today's historians differ over the extent to which the population genuinely believed in socialist propaganda, or whether ordinary citizens employed socialist language as a convenient play to convince their political superiors to grant the people a larger slice of the social cake. There's this concept in like Soviet studies. I think it's put forward by Stephen Kotkin, who wrote like the big book on Magnitogorsk, or Magnetic Mountain, about one of the main Stalinist industrial projects, set to be like the Soviet Union's version of Gary, Indiana. But he has this concept of talking. I don't know if it's talking or speaking Bolshevik, but it's like the idea that like official discourse when common Soviet citizens were making pleas to the state or other officials, they use the language of Bolshevism to gain what they want. The mediation, I guess, of personal demands via the framework of Bolshevik language is what is being referred to here. Studies of Stalinist ideology and culture lend some support to Trotsky's assertion of a 1930s, quote, conservative reaction, end quote, against radical Bolshevism, 1917 style. This viewpoint was expressed in a revised form in N.S. Timashev's popular thesis of the Great Retreat, first formulated in the aftermath of World War II. It says that Nicholas Sergeyevich Timashev, who lived from 1888 to 1970, was a Russian sociologist and professor of jurisprudence and writer. It looks like Great Retreat was a book. Written in 1946. Trying to see if there's any. Yeah, I'm not really seeing like a synopsis. I don't know. Nothing for it. It is still common to read accounts, back to the text, it's still common to read accounts of Stalin's brand of, quote, national Bolshevism as opposed to an earlier commitment to, quote, proletarian internationalism, end quote. It is thus not surprising that the revolution portrayed continues to be extracted in anthologies of classic writings on Stalin and Stalinism. A contemporary review in a leading American academic journal noted that in exiling Trotsky, the Soviet authorities had deprived the regime of an original and inspiring mind. On the whole, The Revolution Betrayed was received as a, quote, brilliant book, end quote. Of course, The Revolution Betrayed could not avoid criticism. Some of its fundamental propositions were questioned. The most severe attacks focused on its most basic premise that there was a pristine period in the revolution's history under Lenin's command. Some object that Lenin was as guilty as Stalin of extinguishing democracy and establishing the rule of bureaucratic elite. Others doubt early Bolshevism's commitment to liberation, especially of women. There could hardly be a, quote, betrayal, end quote, of the revolution, as Trotsky was suggesting, if Stalin's rule did not differ from that of Lenin. Trotsky's definition of the USSR as a worker state, despite its degenerate features, has also not commanded universal acceptance. If one takes the forms of distribution of wealth rather than ownership as the system's defining feature, other models of description will carry more appeal. One of the most recently scholarly accounts of state and society under Stalinism, for example, discusses three alternative ways of conceptualizing its subject: as a form of, quote, prison or conscript army, end quote, as a, quote, boarding school, end quote, or as a, quote, soup kitchen or the relief agency, end quote. Another leading expert prefers to view Stalin's USSR not in isolation, but as a part of a pan-European trend towards a welfare state. Finally, it is worth noting one contemporary reviewer's response to Trotsky's call for a new political revolution to be led by the Fourth International against the Soviet bureaucracy. Did this not provide a, quote, convenient justifications for Stalin's recent ruthless use of the firing squad, end quote? Trotsky was certainly troubled by the frequent reference to a, quote, Trotskyist, end quote, conspiracy in the charge sheets used in the Moscow show trials. On the long boat journey from Norway to Mexico that lasted from mid-December 1936 to mid-January 1937, Trotsky wrote several articles analyzing and refuting Stalin's, quote, frame-ups, end quote. Trotsky detailed the processes by which the GPU brought the accused to confess to blatantly false charge sheets. To begin with, compromising confessions were extracted from friends and colleagues. Once under arrest, defendants were then subjected to a barrage of promises of some leniency in the event of cooperation, and threats if any objections were raised, leveled at themselves and family members. With the necessary signed confessions to hand, the stage was set for the final public humiliation. Courtrooms were packed with secret police masquerading as honest and outraged citizens. Prosecution lawyers and judges, there was to be no defense. Then acted out pre-prepared scripts to the announcement of the inevitable verdict of guilty. The fact that such a spectacle was beyond belief would not, Trotsky warned, prevent the outbreak of further trials. Indeed, there was a logic that suggested that one trial would lead to another. In order to lend a semblance of reality to the fantastic claims of a dangerous anti-Soviet terrorist plot, the authorities would be obliged to bring more, quote, terrorists, end quote, to justice. But why start the trials in the first place? Trotsky discerned base but familiar motives. The elaborate show trials were put on to provide a justification for a reign of terror aimed at the elimination of all opponents. At stake was not so much Stalin's personal rule as the privileges of the bureaucracy. The trials were evidence of the deep unpopularity of the totalitarian regime, and that it was living through a profound crisis. The physical extermination of the old Bolsheviks also provided a graphic illustration of Stalin's betrayal of the original Leninist Bolshevism. To expose the sham nature of the Moscow trials in print was Trotsky's initial and understandable response. But however persuasive Trotsky's case, it was not sufficient proof of his own innocence. To establish this, a more concrete and objective form, one approaching a legally constituted courtroom, was required. Once in Mexico, it became a top priority to set up a quasi-official examination of the accusations leveled against him. The Soviet authorities did not take up his efforts to be extradited and cross-examined in Moscow. Instead, Trotsky asked his followers in the United States to organize a counter-hearing. The quickly formed American Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky soon arranged a committee of inquiry into the Moscow trials. The American Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky was a pseudo-judicial process set up by American Trotskyists as a front organization following the first of the Moscow trials. It had no powers of subpoena and no official imprimatur from any government. It was composed of historians, sociologists, journalists, authors, and other notable figures including Edmund Wilson, Suzanne La Follette, Louis Hacker, Norman Thomas, John Dos Passos, Reinhold Niebuhr, George Novak, Franz Boas, John Chamberlain, and Sidney Hook. John Dewey, then 78 years old, agreed to head its commission of inquiry. That's the Dewey Commission. The Dewey Commission, officially the Commission of Inquiry into the charges made against Leon Trotsky in the Moscow trials, was initiated in March 1937 by the American Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky. It was named after its chairman, the philosopher John Dewey. Its other members were Carleton Beals, Otto Ruhle, that's interesting, Benjamin Stolberg, and Secretary Suzanne La Follette, Alfred Rosemer, Wendell Thomas, Edward A. Ross, John Chamberlain, Carlo Tresca, and Francisco Zamora Padilla. It was seen by some at the time, as Dewey feared it would be, as a Trotskyist front organization. Following months of investigation, the Dewey Commission made its findings public in New York on September 21st, 1937. In this venture, they were aided by a leading American liberal philosopher, John Dewey, who agreed to chair the investigation into Moscow's allegations. John Dewey had a long-standing interest in the USSR, particularly its education system, and had even visited the country in the late 1920s. Trotsky had secured an air of objectivity and authority for clearing his name. After all, what interest, apart from a sense of fair play, could a liberal political opponent of Trotsky and Stalin have? The so-called Dewey Committee worked primarily from the United States, but since Trotsky was denied an American visa, the chief witness's deposition had to be taken in Mexico. Jesus Christ. The counter-show trial was held over a full week in December 1937, with no less than 13 separate sessions, lasting a total of 41 hours. It was held in Trotsky's study in Rivera's house, where the Bronsteins were lodging. A subsequent publication of the verbatim transcript of the hearing runs to some 600 pages. Apart from Trotsky's lawyer and the committee, room was set aside for members of the press and interested public associations. The result was a gripping spectacle. Trotsky was subjected to a rigorous examination and cross-examination. Trotsky fielded questions not only about his supposed headship of an anti-Soviet conspiracy, but also connected his pre- and post-revolutionary career more generally. At times, the minutes read as if the committee was using its investigation to satisfy a student-like curiosity about the Russian Revolution. Dewey was particularly interested in Trotsky's relationship with Stalin. Why did the quote, prophet outcast, end quote, lose to the, quote, gravedigger of the revolution, end quote? And if the tables were turned, would Trotsky guarantee his rival the rights he was currently seeking for himself? To Trotsky's credit, he responded freely and readily to all queries, whether they bore a direct or indirect relevance to the task at hand. A standard Western legal courtroom may have been less willing to enter into a broader historical discussion. As it was, Trotsky stood the test of the witness stand well. The Moscow-based claims that he had created a terrorist fascist-sponsored network in the USSR was refuted. Indeed, how could Trotsky have met with Piatakov to pass on counter-revolutionary orders, as was claimed in the January 1937 trial, for example, when it was clear that neither Trotsky nor Piatakov was at the appointed airport, and when the relevant authorities could confirm that no planes had landed at the supposed times. After several months of further investigation, in late 1937, the Dewey Committee announced its findings. The Moscow trials were declared an unreliable guide to the truth, the accusations against Trotsky unproven. Trotsky was understandably pleased with the Dewey Committee's conclusions, claiming them as irrefutable proof that Stalin had staged, quote, the greatest legal forgery in world history, end quote. The favorable outcome for Trotsky would not have come as a bolt from the blue to the rest of the interested world, for skepticism about the veracity of the Moscow show trials was already widespread. The London Times, for example, duly noted the Dewey Committee's findings in a short report published in December 1937. However, independently of Trotsky's efforts, earlier in the year it had carried an editorial statement on the Moscow show trials. This contained a skeptical view of events in Moscow and a frank portrayal of the trials' negative consequences. Trotsky would surely have applauded most of the bourgeois newspapers' analysis. Quote, it is clear that M. Stalin is bent on consolidating his position, eliminating on whatever pretext any of his comrades who are or who may be potential sources of opposition to Stalin's aims. Dictatorships need enemies for internal consumption, The villainies of the Trotskyists ring with wearisome redundance in the ears of the Russian public. The world has ceased to be stirred by new events in Russia, The damage which these ultra-Georgian tactics have done to the Soviet Union has been enormous. France contemplates without enthusiasm her alliance with a country where treason appears to be a national pastime, The lives of prominent servants of the state are cheaper than they were in the darkest days of Rome's decline, and the charges brought against them imply, whether they are true or false, a fundamental unsoundness of the administration. And there have been other changes as well, To watch M. Stalin lopping off the heads of the tallest and reddest poppies is intriguing rather than edifying, for Stalin's ruthless prescriptions are not in part condoned, as perhaps Lenin's were, by fanatical devotion to a fixed ideal. The revolutionary tenets have gone, together with, but more unobtrusively than, most of the men who made it possible to put them into practice. They have been replaced by a botched tissue of dogma as shifting, adaptable, and elusive as a mirage. End quote. That's from the Times. What Times? Is it the London Times? Yeah, the London Times. Reading this, Stalin, who followed the bulletin of the opposition closely, could have been forgiven if he perceived Trotsky's influence at play. The Times sentiments are more indicative, however, of the fact that Trotsky was not alone in doubting the validity of the Moscow show trials. One should not belittle the Mexico exile's determination to prove his innocence, but against a background of general disbelief in Stalin's state-managed trials, the Dewey Committee's verdict did not make headline news. Trotsky himself was disappointed that his supporters were not able to take more political capital out of the Dewey Committee, perhaps by turning it into a more permanent institution. But as the Times pointed out, the public had already become desensitized to more episodes of the Russian Fantastica. An American Trotskyist subsequently recalled having tried to raise the interest of a local journalist in Russian developments, only to be asked, quote, what did the Moscow trials mean in Kokomo, Indiana, end quote. That Stalin's great terror might turn people, and specifically workers, away from socialism troubled Trotsky greatly. He thought it crucial that the bureaucratic assault on socialism underway in the USSR should not be mistaken for the genuine article. In this dark hour for communism, it was of vital importance to expound and defend real Marxism. While Trotsky was grateful to Dewey for his work on the Committee of Inquiry, he was keen to stress his differences with the kind professor about the merits of Marxism over liberalism. It was in this context that in February 1938, Trotsky completed a short but passionate essay, Their Morals and Ours, dedicated to his son Lev Sedov, who had just died in Paris following successive operations. Their Morals and Ours is a curious work. Its language shifts from angry invective to more reasoned discussion of successive philosophical trends, including the Jesuits, Herbert Spencer, and Immanuel Kant, from a calm advocacy of, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, against, quote, philosophical idealism, end quote, to a rabid denunciation of, quote, petty bourgeois theoreticians and moralists, end quote. The chief intention and the recurrent theme, however, were to refute the suggestion that Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin were moral equivalents. For Trotsky, to equate Bolshevism and Stalinism was to commit the gravest of errors, to ignore the contradictory ends that each served at various stages of the class struggle. Thus, for example, it was permissible for Trotsky to decree the taking of white officer family members as hostages in the midst of the Russian Civil War, for it served the revolution in its ascendancy. The GPU's employment of the same tactic against Marxist opponents was, on the contrary, worthy of condemnation, because Stalin was seeking to demolish the revolution and the Bolshevik Party. For Trotsky, there could be no eternal laws of behavior suitable for all circumstances. Rather, quote, moral evaluations along with political evaluations flow from the inner needs of the struggle, end quote. Dewey responded several months later. For him, Trotsky's answer to the thorny issue of moral conundrums was based on a brand of, quote, absolutism, end quote. Trotsky had simply sidestepped this issue of how to judge which means really do lead to the liberation of mankind by referring to the exigencies of the class struggle as the supreme law of history. Dewey could not comprehend how this took matters beyond a contested arena of disputes as to who really represents progress in history. Trotsky claimed such a status for himself in the Fourth International, but there were no obviously objective grounds or criteria for deciding if Trotsky was right. It was simply an issue of faith. Trotsky did not pen a counter-response to Dewey's concerns, preferring to leave this task to one of his secretaries. In this way, the debate simply fizzled out. As matters stood, Trotsky could be satisfied that he had exploited one more setting to serve the political imperative of exposing Stalinism as a betrayal of Bolshevik Marxism. The outbreak of the Great Purges not only motivated Trotsky to engage in a defense of the ABC of Marxism, Trotsky also became more receptive to publishers' request for a biography of Joseph Stalin. It was a project that Trotsky was unable to finish. Research was ongoing at the time of his assassination. The story completed to the author's satisfaction only in 1917. There was sufficient material to hand, however, for the posthumous publication of a book of several hundred pages. Of all the biographical sketches and essays penned by Trotsky, one might think that the portrait of Stalin presented the most difficulties. After all, Trotsky admitted that he came to know of Stalin only after 1917, and then in mainly negative context. Would not the history of their personal and political relations severely cloud Trotsky's judgment? Elsewhere, Trotsky had written that he felt no hatred for Stalin as a person. His anti-Stalin tracts were strictly political in nature, based upon an appreciation of, quote, objective conditions, end quote. In introducing the biography, Trotsky reassured the reader that he had not overlooked, quote, a single fact, document, or bit of testimony redounding to the benefit of the hero of this book, ... If all this is not objectivity, then I ask, what is objectivity, end quote. Trotsky. At the same time, however, there is a clear indication of a likely bias in the book. In a brief discussion of the political leadership, for example, Hitler is described as a, quote, orator, end quote. Marx, Engels, and Lenin as, quote, thinkers and writers, end quote. Stalin is seen as unique. Quote, Stalin is neither a thinker, a writer, nor an orator. ... Stalin took possession of power not with the aid of personal qualities, but with the aid of an impersonal machine. It was not Stalin who created the machine, but the machine created Stalin, ... Stalin did not create the machine, but took possession of the machine. For this, exceptional and special qualities were necessary, but they were not qualities of the historic initiator, thinker, writer, or orator. The machine had grown out of ideas. Stalin's first qualification was a contemptuous attitude towards ideas, end quote. Trotsky. The biography's primary concern was therefore to outline the influences in Stalin's career through which a, quote, personality of this sort was formed, end quote. There was thus a pre-existing thesis to be confirmed. The suspicion remains that Trotsky would find in Stalin's life what he was looking for. The chapter Family and School, for example, considers conflicting evaluations of the young Stalin, from a hard-working and able boy devoted to study and song to a rude, vengeful, and cynical character. Trotsky always finds reasons to favor the latter interpretation, emphasizing how social, family, and school environments combine to produce a blend of, quote, grit, shrewdness, craftiness, and cruelty, a clever schemer, a cynic, a person capable of the lowest sort of conniving, end quote. In his youth, Stalin developed, we are told, a negative psychology obsessed with the, quote, bad side, end quote, of human nature. It was this that made of Stalin a likely hero of an, quote, epoch of reaction which crystallizes egoism and perfidy, end quote. Periods of progress dominated by lofty idealism had no place for a man of Stalin's mold. Already in the first main chapter, then, the biographer has resolved that his subject possessed no great intellect or ability, nor a redeeming character. The subsequent account of Stalin's political career to 1917 tells of failures, disappointments, and a hurt sense of pride. It presents the Georgian revolutionist as a, quote, unknown figure, end quote, in the party's history. One who remained, quote, on the sidelines, sullen, alarmed by the flood of nature at springtide, and it was always malevolent, His hurt provincial self-satisfaction must inevitably have been colored with envy, mitigated only by cautiousness, end quote. Trotsky. It did not escape the attention of contemporary reviewers that the book was marred by a profound dislike of its main actor. It is the least satisfactory of Trotsky's forays into the art of biography. International Relations in World Revolution. International affairs of the mid to late 1930s were hit by several crises. In late 1935, Italy sought by military means to consolidate a position in North Africa. In 1936, what turned into a 3-year civil war began in Spain as General Franco's nationalist army attacked the Republican government. Most troublesome of all, however, was the pressure put upon post-World War I settlement in Europe, largely by a resurgent and rearming Germany. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Austria numbered among Hitler's targets for revision. There was an unseemly scramble for security and gains. It proved impossible to forge a united anti-Hitler coalition. Czechoslovakia was a notable victim, partitioned as a result of an agreement between Great Britain, France, Italy, and Germany at the Munich Conference of September 1938. No other power was willing to fight for its defense. Hitler's demands were not satisfied by such concessions, as the policy of appeasement hoped, but led to another world war following Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939. Trotsky continued to criticize Soviet foreign policy for being unable to cope with the demands of these troublesome times. The charges leveled at Stalin were familiar. The Kremlin, Trotsky accused, was betraying the world revolution by poor leadership, subordinating the Comintern to the narrow national interests of the ruling bureaucratic elite. The specific target of Trotsky's chagrin was a fresh turn in the Comintern's tactics towards the so-called Popular Front, or the readiness of communists to join broad anti-fascist coalitions to save countries from fascist takeovers. The idea was first elaborated by French and Czechoslovakian communists after Hitler had come to power in Germany. It took a further 2 years of discussion and persuasion before it was approved by the Comintern's political secretariat in January 1935 and by the 7th Congress later that summer. Although the initiative for the Popular Front lay with the national sections, particularly the large anti-fascist strikes in France in February 1934, in which socialist and communist workers collaborated quite successfully, Trotsky discerned only Stalin's malicious hand behind the new orientation. It was, Trotsky thought, part of Soviet diplomatic efforts to woo the bourgeois non-fascist powers into a collective security agreement to contain Nazi Germany. In order to reassure the bourgeois West that the USSR was a reliable ally, the Popular Front policy had been thrust upon national communist parties as a way of saving the bourgeoisie from revolutionary possibilities. This was evident above all for Trotsky in France and Spain. Both countries were, he was convinced, in the midst of a revolutionary situation. Above all, the masses were radicalized and ready for action, while capitalism was in terminal decline. For the people to stage a triumphant socialist revolution, however, the communists would have to mount a vigorous extreme left-wing campaign. It was time to hoist a program of radical social change, including the call to establish Soviets, for lands to be transferred to the peasants, and for the workers' control of the mills and factories. Instead, the Stalinists had proposed collaboration with the bourgeoisie and popular fronts as a way of protecting private property in the capitalist order. In the French context, it was a policy designed, according to Trotsky, to kill the faith of the, to quote, is that a quote? Or is that dirt? Quote, the faith of the masses in the revolutionary road and to drive them into the arms of the fascist counter-revolution, end quote, Trotsky. Assessing the lessons of the Spanish Civil War, Trotsky entertained no doubts as to who was most to blame for the fall of the Republican regime. Quote, Franco needed help from the opposite side of the battlefront, and Trotsky obtained this aid. Franco needed help from the opposite side of the battlefront, and Franco obtained this aid. Franco's chief assistant was and still is Stalin, ... The Spanish proletariat gave proof of the extraordinary capacity for initiative and revolutionary heroism. The revolution was brought to ruin by petty, despicable, and utterly corrupted, quote, leaders, end quote. ... Moscow feared above all that the disturbance of private property in the Iberian Peninsula would bring London and Paris nearer to Berlin against the USSR, ... All the actions of the Moscow agents in Spain were directed toward paralyzing any independent movement of the workers and peasants and reconciling the bourgeoisie with a moderate republic, ... Under the label of the Popular Front, they set up a joint stock company. Under the leadership of Stalin, they have assured the most terrible defeat when all the conditions of victory were at hand, end quote, Trotsky. There is some merit in Trotsky's biting critique of the Comintern's record in France and Spain. The Spanish communist attack on the Trotskyist sections in Spain, for example, undoubtedly diverted resources away from the struggle against the nationalist forces. Overall, however, Trotsky's thesis of a Stalinist betrayal of the world revolution is as one-sided as it is unconvincing. It ignores, for example, the positive aspects of the Popular Front tactic evident in the expansion of the Communist Party's support and influence. Recent studies of Comintern thinking reveal a lack of consensus over the exact meaning of the Popular Front. Many activists, including Stalin, remained distrustful of bourgeois parliamentarism and saw the Popular Front as useful only insofar as the Popular Front improved the prospects for socialism. This was a far cry from Trotsky's version of the Popular Front as a means of subduing the revolutionary tide so as to produce an image of an unthreatening USSR for bourgeois consumption. In actual fact, reformist socialists and pro-capitalists became still more wary of communism given the rise in communist popularity in the Popular Front era. If the Popular Front was to serve the ends of Soviet diplomacy as defined by Trotsky, then the tactic was counterproductive. There is also no evidence to confirm Trotsky's contention, however, that Comintern tactics were dependent on the demands of Soviet diplomacy. In the 1930s, there was no certainty that the policy of collective security would bear any fruit, and the option of an agreement with Germany remained open. Presenting an overly simplified account of the relationship between Soviet security needs and Comintern policy, Trotsky also tended to overestimate the efficiency of a line of command running from the Kremlin to operatives on the ground. Despite a network of advisors in Spain, for example, a combination of factors from uncertain lines of communication to the fragmented and confused nature of regional circumstances allowed a strong Spanish Communist Party to take numerous initiatives of its own accord. The ferocity of the Spanish Communist move against native Trotskyists had as much to do with local rivalries, it has been suggested, as with orders from Moscow. Finally, the accusation of betraying the world revolution, which Trotsky threw at incompetent left allies as well as outright Stalinists, is hard to uphold if there was little chance for a successful communist uprising in Spain and France in the 1930s. In this context, one should note that even commentators sympathetic to Trotsky admit he continually overestimated revolutionary possibilities. Indeed, isolated and deprived of much information, it is hard to see how Trotsky could become a reliable guide to complex and fluid international events. A stern critic of Stalin as leader of the world communist movement, Trotsky also perceived no merit in the Kremlin's diplomacy in the lead up to World War II. Trotsky did not doubt that another world war was in the offing. It would arise, Trotsky argued, out of the selfsame imperialist antagonisms that had produced the previous conflict of 1914 to 18. It was on this basis that Trotsky refused to make a distinction between the hostile camps, say between fascist and anti-fascist armies. All the capitalist powers were to be condemned as predatory and imperialist. In an era of monopoly capitalism, which economic survival and growth was predicated upon controlling colonies, a resurgent German capitalism could not help but seek world domination. The countries in decline, chiefly France and Britain, could equally not help but resist German attempts at global supremacy. If the great powers were nothing but pawns of underlying economic trends demanding the abolition of national frontiers, Trotsky was understandably skeptical about the attempts to satisfy Hitler's appetite by the policy of appeasement. The division of Czechoslovakia in Germany's favor merely gave Berlin a better base for unleashing a future war, he warned, and did not guarantee, quote, peace in our time, end quote, as the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain thought. The only uncertainty about the looming war for Trotsky was how German strategy would unfold. Trotsky identified German militarism driven by an expanding economy as the likely aggressor, but even the rearmed German army would not wish to begin a war on more than one front. A choice had to be made between striking first to the west or to the east. In making this tactical decision, Trotsky was certain that Berlin could expect support from Stalin should it decide to begin its offensive in the west. Trotsky thought that the overriding aim of Soviet diplomacy was to keep the USSR out of war. The Soviet bureaucracy feared a conflict, Trotsky argued, because the Soviet bureaucracy would be unlikely to withstand the strains of modern warfare. Not only had it undermined the Red Army's fighting capacity and the purge of its leading military commanders, but the people would welcome the war as an opportunity to overthrow the hated bureaucracy. Trotsky interpreted this Nazi-Soviet pact of September 1939 not as a bolt from the blue, but as the favored option of a Soviet leadership willing to sign any humiliating agreement to save its privileged position within the USSR. Thus far, one can congratulate Trotsky for damning appeasement, but must question both his characterization of the great powers and his account of international diplomacy in the years immediately preceding September 1939. Although it made sense in Trotsky's terms to dismiss each capitalist power as imperialist, it was surely blind of Trotsky to deny that the question of who won the conflict was no more than a matter of indifference. For Trotsky, whoever the victor was, humanity would be the loser in both a material and cultural sense. Yet at the same time and subsequently, it was clear that there could be a profound difference, if only on the racial grounds that Trotsky discounted as an important part of Nazi ideology, to the fate of Europe and the world should Hitler prevail. It was for this reason that the American public opinion rightly preferred Stalin to Hitler, even while it condemned the many crimes committed in Moscow. Trotsky was also wrong to claim Stalin as Hitler's best friend. Recent studies suggest that the Nazi-Soviet pact was the outcome of a last-minute decision and was largely a response to the Paris and London governments' unwillingness to make a firm commitment to Moscow. The collective security line may not have borne the intended results, but it is a gross error to claim that the USSR always preferred an alliance with Germany. Finally, Trotsky clearly underestimated the capacity of the USSR to withstand a German declaration of war, which eventually occurred in June 1941, which was after Trotsky died. Stalin proved himself a capable war leader, standing firm at the helm in the initial confusion surrounding the first moments of the German attack. More generally, the Soviet government was able to maintain the loyalty of its citizens in the aptly named Great Patriotic War. Rather than succumbing to an ignominious defeat, as Trotsky predicted, Stalinism was, if anything, strengthened by World War II, extending its hold over Russia and expanding into Eastern Europe. If Trotsky was content to reinterpret the causes of World War II through the prism of a Marxist analysis of events in 1914, he also thought that the internationalist tactics of 1914 to 18 would hold good for the battles of 1939 onwards. In World War I, the internationalist left, while initially in a minority, had eventually led a revolution in Russia and created the Third International. Now Trotsky argued the internationalist left had to renew old campaigns, but under the banner of the Fourth International. Trotsky was highly optimistic about the future fortunes of the Fourth International, despite the fractious and splintered nature of the small bands of supporters Trotsky was able to attract in his lifetime. He thought that a bankrupt and decaying capitalism would no longer be able to prop up reformist socialist parties and trade unions by welfare programs. The workers would face an impoverishment not experienced for over a century. They would be hungry and angry, but at least prepared by the war, most especially in military training for an all-out attack on capitalism. Fortunately, they would have an exemplary vanguard leadership in the Fourth International. For Trotsky, the Fourth International could pride itself on being the only political body that had correctly foreseen the march of history, and the one political force that had elaborated a revolutionary program for a just and plentiful order. Under the guidance of the Fourth International, Trotsky envisaged the world proletariat establishing pan-continental Soviet regimes across Europe, the Americas, and Asia as stepping stones to creation of a world socialist federation. The dreadful alternative was capitalist misery with its inevitable rounds of further wars of destruction. Trotsky thus placed mighty tasks before his followers. It was obvious even to Trotsky that at the time of writing the Fourth International was not equal to the Fourth International's historic mission. Indeed, in a review of the Revolution Betrayed, the scholar Bertram D. Wolfe had correctly identified the Fourth International's weaknesses as mirroring those of the Third. Quote, as to bureaucracy, is Trotsky's Fourth International any more democratic, any less a one-man show, any less dominated by its, quote, Russian faction, end quote, and factional considerations, end quote? Bertram D. Wolfe. I think Bertram D. Wolfe was like a communist that became anti-communist. When did he leave the Communist Party? Looks like he was the Communist Party opposition, which was like the right oppositionist, which became the Independent Labor League under J. Lovestone. I don't know. While writing this, it seems like he was part of like the Lovestone right opposition. So back to the text. The prospects of the small and divided Fourth International deteriorated still further when it lost its guru in the assassination of August 1940. New section. Assassination. In the opening months of 1940, Trotsky was concerned that his death, when it came, would arise out of natural causes. Troubled by bouts of high blood pressure and convinced that a fatal brain hemorrhage was an imminent threat, Trotsky composed 2 drafts of a brief testament to become public knowledge after his demise. Here, Trotsky thanked loyal friends and paid special tribute to his wife. Indeed, Trotsky was fortunate in his choice of a life partner. Natalia's political interests matched those of her husband. A less politically committed wife may not have stuck with him through the twists and turns of his political career, yet Trotsky did not acknowledge an intellectual relationship, highlighting the emotional support Trotsky had derived from her, quote, love, magnanimity, and tenderness, end quote. The testament's main message was, as ever, political and concerned Trotsky himself, quote, if I had to begin all over again, I would of course try to avoid this or that mistake, but the main course of my life would remain unchanged. I shall die a proletarian revolutionist, a Marxist, a dialectical materialist, and consequently an irreconcilable atheist. My faith in the communist future of mankind is not less ardent. Indeed, it is firmer today than it was in the days of my youth. ... Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full, end quote. Trotsky. If pessimism regarding his health continued to worry Trotsky, then at the end of May 1940, Trotsky received a rude reminder of an alternative form of death. Given the execution of leading old Bolsheviks who had made no public critical remarks about Stalin, there was no reason to assume that the Kremlin's leading opponent would be spared by virtue of his exile. Indeed, Stalin's long-standing desire to have Trotsky eliminated may have been heightened by the effectiveness of Trotskyist propaganda in the world communist movement. A recent study of the Communist Party of Great Britain on the eve of World War II, for example, shows Soviet operatives worried about the threat posed to Moscow's domination of rank-and-file hearts and minds by left opposition activists. Furthermore, Stalin may have wanted to bring Trotsky's work on his biography to an abrupt end before the manuscript. Furthermore, Trotsky may have wanted to bring Trotsky's work on Stalin's biography to an abrupt end before the manuscript was complete. Whatever the exact motivation, at some point the necessary orders were given to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, NKVD, for Trotsky to be assassinated. A first unsuccessful attempt was made in the early hours of May 24th, when the Soviet security services tried to murder Trotsky in Chicago gangland fashion. A group of around 20 armed men masquerading as police officials tied up the guards at the front of Trotsky's house without resistance. Once in the main courtyard, the would-be assassins fired rounds of ammunition into the main rooms, including Trotsky's study and bedroom. By sheer good fortune, and to Stalin's annoyance, the intended victim survived. For Trotsky, the attack could equally have been the work of Hitler's Gestapo as the USSR's NKVD. However, Trotsky considered that since he was more of a political threat to Stalin, the Kremlin was the more likely sponsor. The fullest account of the assault as experienced by Trotsky was published in early June 1940 in the article Stalin Seeks My Death. Quote, "The attack came at 4 a.m. I was fast asleep, having taken a sleeping drug after a hard day's work. Awakened by the rattle of gunfire but feeling hazy, I first imagined that a national holiday was being celebrated with fireworks outside our walls. But the explosions were too close, right here within the room next to me and overhead. The shooting continued incessantly. My wife later told me that she helped me to the floor, pushing me into the space between the bed and the wall, ... Splinters of glass from window panes and chips from walls flew in all directions. A little later I discovered that my right leg had been slightly wounded in 2 places. As the shooting died down, we heard our grandson in the neighboring room cry out, quote, 'Grandfather,' end quote. The voice of the child in the darkness under the gunfire remains the most tragic recollection of that night," end quote. Trotsky was convinced that one failure would not prevent the NKVD from making further attempts on his life. Indeed, the efforts to kill Trotsky would no doubt be redoubled, since only a successful elimination would restore the security services to good standing with their master. Furthermore, Stalin needed the murder of, quote, "enemy number one," end quote, to, quote, "demonstrate his power," end quote. With an eye on future risks to the leader, funds were raised chiefly by followers in the United States to upgrade the security arrangements at Trotsky's house. What the best-laid security plans could not account for, however, was a fatal blow coming from a member of the household itself. Even before the events of the 24th of May, the NKVD had managed to infiltrate Trotsky's closest circles. One agent had provided a detailed plan of the house and the use made of its rooms. Another operative, the Spanish communist Ramon Mercader, from a family known for its loyalty to Moscow, had established a love affair with one of Trotsky's secretaries, Sylvia Agilov, as early as September 1938. By May 1940, Mercader, who also went under the names of Jacques Monard and Frank Jackson, was familiar to the Bronsteins as a charming friend of Sylvia, a businessman who occasionally rendered kind services, such as taking Natalia and Sylvia on shopping excursions in his car. When Trotsky's close friends Alfred and Marguerite Rosmer left Moscow after a stay of several months, it was Mercader who drove them to their ship. The Soviet agent in charge of operations in Moscow, Naum Eitingon, decided that Mercader offered the best chance of killing Trotsky. Wikipedia says Nahum Eitingon, also known as Leonid Alexandrovich Eitingon, lived from 1899 to 1981 and was a Soviet intelligence officer who gained prominence through his involvement in several NKVD operations, including the assassination of Leon Trotsky, the orchestration of partisan movements during World War II, and atomic espionage. Eitingon has been described by Yevgeny Kiselyov as one of the organizers and managers of the state terrorism system under Joseph Stalin and a later victim thereof. He may have been a great cousin of Max Oettingen, though this has been disputed. So there you are. Mercader used the excuse of a growing interest in Trotskyism to seek a private audience. On the 17th of August 1940, he presented Trotsky with a brief article on American Trotskyism. 3 days later, Mercader returned unannounced with a typewritten version. Trotsky invited Mercader into the study. Mercader seized the opportunity of taking Trotsky unawares. Mercader crushed an ice pick, previously concealed in a raincoat, into his victim's head. In the assassin's words, quote, Trotsky gave a cry that I shall never forget. It was a long ah, endlessly long, and I think it still echoes in my brain. Trotsky jumped up jerkily, rushed at me, and bit my hand. Look, you can see the marks of his teeth. I pushed him away, and he fell to the floor. Then he rose and stumbled out of the room. End quote. Mercader. Trotsky survived the immediate blow, but not its consequences. Trotsky soon fell into a coma from which he did not awake. Death occurred on the evening on the 21st of August at a local hospital. In arranging a spectacular death for Trotsky, Stalin guaranteed his rival a return to headline news. In a replay of Lenin's lying in state, but on a smaller scale, thousands of visitors filed past Trotsky's body. The American government may have refused a request that Trotsky be laid to rest in New York, but in the event, large crowds matched the funeral procession in Mexico City. An obituary in the London Times paid tribute to Trotsky's life. It noted his role as Lenin's, quote, principal associate, end quote, pointing out that contrary to the statements of the, quote, official historians, end quote, who belittled Trotsky's significance, it was Trotsky who organized the October Revolution and, quote, brought the Red Army into being, end quote. Although the Times saw Trotsky as posing no political threat to Stalin or to capitalism, it admitted that Trotsky, quote, remained a name, end quote, around whom, quote, communists who opposed the opportunistic policy of Stalin, end quote, gathered. Finally, the obituary mentioned Trotsky's, quote, outstanding literary abilities, end quote, evident above all in Trotsky's autobiography and The History of the Russian Revolution, the book The History of the Russian Revolution. Such thoughts were an early indication of Deutscher's subsequent argument that Trotsky experienced a form of, quote, victory, end quote, in death. The circumstances of Trotsky's death also helped him to gain a more enduring fame. This is evident not only in the films, books, and popular songs mentioned at the start of this book. Trotsky was once even described in a perverse and unjustified claim as, quote, the greatest Jew since Jesus Christ, end quote. To be fair, however, Trotsky would not have appreciated the reference to race or to religion. The end.